Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us in CCPL's the academic year 2022-2023 first Zoom book webinar. I am Po Jan Yap, Professor of Law at the Law Faculty, Hong Kong U, and also Director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law. Today, we have two distinguished speakers who will be discussing a new phenomenal book that's just hot off the press. I have the book here, Opposing Power, Building Opposition Alliances in Electoral Autocracies, University of Michigan Press, 2022. We have here today with us the author, Professor Elvin Ong from the National University of Singapore, and our distinguished discussant, Professor Jin Hong from University of Michigan. I would briefly introduce the speakers, and then I'll pass over the floor to the author. Right? So Professor Elvin Ong is an assistant professor of political science at the National University of Singapore. Previously, he was the postdoctoral fellow at UBC, University of British Columbia, and he received his PhD in political science from Emory University. Professor Ji-Yeon Hong is an associate professor of political science and Korea Foundation professor of Korean studies at University of Michigan. Previously, she was an associate professor at our neighbor, Hong Kong UST. Now, before I turn the floor over to Professor Ong, allow me to quickly summarize the book for some of us who may not have read it beforehand. And I'll just do it very briefly, and I'm sure Professor Ong will elaborate upon my summary. So basically, his phenomenal book, right, examines the conditions in which the opposition in electoral autocracies will create alliances against the ruling government. In Professor Ong's view, opposition party leaders are very sensitive to the costs and benefits of forming alliances between themselves. In short, he argues that two variables decisively impact their decision to form an opposition alliance. Number one, the opposition perceive the ruling regime to be politically vulnerable. Number two, the opposition perceive their chances of victory are dependent on the opposition parties working together. And Professor Ong seeks to demonstrate this central argument by looking at the Philippines, South Korea in the 1980s, and Malaysia and Singapore over the past decades. With that, I'll pass the floor to Professor Ong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yep, let me just try to see if I can share my screen now. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to present my work, my book to a Hong Kong audience. I'm very thankful for the discussant role provided by Professor Hong. So I'll just take about the next 20 minutes to try to briefly run through the key arguments in the book, and then we'll have the discussion comments and a Q&A after that. So let me just slowly begin. Okay, cool. So in the past few decades, political scientists have recognized that the world is not just simply divided into free and fair liberal democracies on the one hand and closed repressive autocracies on the other. Then in fact, a lot of regimes are in the gray zone in the middle, and these are typically known as hybrid regimes or electoral authoritarian regimes. And what this means is typically that they have the facade of democratic elections, but not necessarily the substance of these elections. And what this means is that a lot of these electoral autocrats, they'll put in a lot of obstacles to prevent the opposition parties from competing freely and fairly. And there's also a lot of repression by the dominant incumbent autocrats to manipulate the electoral process as well as to coerce the opposition parties. And so these kind of hybrid regimes are amongst the most common regime type in the world right now. And some of the contemporary examples are Putin's Russia, Erdogan's Turkey, Maduro's Venezuela, as well as Hun Sen's Cambodia. And in all these regimes, they are very long and lasting and durable because of all the repression that the states have done to coerce the opposition as well as to manipulate the electoral process. But despite the longevity of these regimes, political scientists also sometimes recognize that these regimes can sometimes fall even in the condition of unfree and unfair elections. So in places like Mexico, Kenya, as well as Malaysia, these dominant incumbents can actually lose. And therefore, political scientists have been trying to dig deep about what are the ingredients of opposition victory in these elections, the unfree and unfair elections. And so one of the crucial ingredients which seems to suggest point the way forward for opposition victory is opposition alliance formation. So this is just my statistical analysis of a large N data set. We suggest the predicted probability of opposition victory with and without an opposition alliance. So if you don't have an opposition alliance, the chances of victory is only about 15%. It's not going to be a lot. It's very low, actually. But if you do have an opposition alliance, the chances of victory more than double to close to 40%. Now, this is by no means, better than a coin flip, but it's still better than nothing, right? But on the other hand, we also, when we dive into these large N data sets, we also find that alliance formation is quite rare. Depending on which large N data set you look at and how they code opposition alliances across different time periods, what we find is that alliance formation only occurs about 15 to 20% of all of these unfree and unfair elections. So despite being very crucial, alliance formation is also very rare. And this prompts the research question in my book, which is when do opposition parties actually build these pre-electoral alliances, right? Under what circumstances will they do it? So in the rest of this presentation, I will briefly introduce the concepts and theoretical arguments in my book. I'll briefly demonstrate these main arguments through a comparison of 1986 Philippines and 1987 South Korea. And I will very briefly touch on the Malaysia-Singapore comparison in the book, which lasts much more than just the 2 years in 1986 and 87, but lasts over 5 decades from 1965 to 2020. And I'll say a little bit about what's the advantage of us doing that. So the first thing is about that most social scientists think, right, when we talk about doing some research work is to think hard about our concepts, right? What do they actually mean? And this book actually dives into thinking hard about what do we mean when we say opposition alliances. And in the book, I suggest there are 2 parts to an opposition alliance, part 1 and part 2. And part 1 is really about coordinating elites. When there are too many opposition candidates contesting against the incumbent, the votes will be split and there will be a reduced probability of winning. So party leaders need to coordinate what I call candidate selection, right? And of course, in a presidential system, you can imagine party A opposition leader and party B opposition leader fighting among themselves who should be that sole candidate contesting against the incumbent autocrat. Should it be party A leader or party B leader? You can imagine that if both of them contest against the incumbent, that the opposition votes will be split and there'll be a reduced probability of winning, right? Now, in the legislative election, the problem is actually multiplied across the geographical map. Right? When party A and party B leaders, they now need to coordinate themselves which party's candidate should stand in which constituency in order to maximize their vote share and seat share. So there can be many ways in which the party leaders will split the seats among themselves. And you can imagine that they will bargain and negotiate with each other to have a 3-3 divide here, right? But that's only one potential outcome. There are other potential outcomes like 4-2, 1-5, so on and so forth. And that depends on a wide variety of factors. The second problem which party leaders will encounter is the problem of coordinating voters. Because opposition supporters will not necessarily follow their leader to support the agreed upon candidate, so party leaders need to mount national joint campaigns to persuade and encourage the supporters to engage in what I call cross-party vote transfer. And to simplify this, right, you can imagine that you have a unidimensional ideological spectrum, and the autocrat is in the middle because he wants to capture most of the votes. And then you have an opposition party A that is circular and opposition party B that is primarily religious. And so if opposition party leaders A and B, they sort of coordinate a candidate selection, you can imagine that the supporters of party A will not necessarily want to vote for the candidates from party B if the candidates from party B are contesting in the district, right, or becomes the presidential candidate. And the supporters of party B will not necessarily want to vote for candidates from party A. So they need to encourage cross-party vote transfer to vote for the opposition party, no matter who it might be, right, against that autocrat. And so there are many ways to mount these national joint campaigns. And in Malaysia, what we actually see them do is that they have a common manifesto, which spells out all the different promises that opposition alliance will implement, right, if they actually win in the elections. And they also use the common logo so as to coordinate all the voter expectations about which party to vote for. So in a very small picture below, you can see there's an actual photo of a nomination day, which I took in Malaysia. All three candidates standing in the middle, they were all from three different opposition parties, and none of them were from the party which you can see the logo in the background, right? They were all using another opposition party's logo. So with these two things in mind, we can imagine that for opposition party leaders, there are a lot of visceral costs to developing these two kind of coordination. The first one is obviously the cost of withdrawing candidates, right? Be it in the legislative elections or in the presidential elections, the candidates' drops may be upset, and they may threaten to contest alone, therefore upsetting the entire reason why we should have opposition alliances in the first place. Then there's also the cost of ideological compromise. The party members and supporters may not like the compromises in a common manifesto. They may think that the party has deviated too much from their ideological premise in the first place, and they may launch an intra-party revolt, or they will withhold their support for the party. And then finally, of course, the loss of campaign autonomy when party leaders lose control over their campaign strategy. And so these costs are very visceral in the minds of opposition party leaders, because building an alliance could actually incur a backlash onto their actions, right? So party leaders therefore are very sensitive to the cost of forming alliances, and therefore it's only in very rare circumstances where they will actually think about forming alliances. And in the book, my primary argument is that alliance building only occurs if all opposition party leaders perceive that the benefits of alliance formation exceeds its visceral costs. And so here the emphasis is on number one, perception, that the benefits outweigh its costs, and number two, that it has to be a kind of universal perception, right, for all opposition party leaders. If it's only one or two, or a handful of opposition party leaders who believe that they must form an alliance, alliance building will probably not occur. And so in trying to weigh whether benefits outweigh its costs, party leaders ask themselves two questions. The first question that they ask themselves is, well, is the incumbent regime really vulnerable? Right? Do we really have a chance of winning against the incumbent if we compete as an alliance, right? And sometimes the answer will be yes, sometimes the answer will be no. And in the book, I suggest in circumstances where there are multiple regime-debilitating events occurring within a short period of time, then the answer is most likely going to be yes. I'll be happy to clarify in the Q&A what does multiple regime-debilitating events occurring in a short period of time mean. But nevertheless, the idea is these events will shock everyone equally, right? And that will generate a momentum to pushing everyone into perceiving that the incumbent regime going to be vulnerable and their chances of winning are actually quite high. Then the second question party leaders ask themselves is, do we really need each other to win? So do we really depend on your help in order to win, right? Perhaps I could win on my own. I don't need your help, all right, to win. So if the answer is no, I do not need your help to win, then I say that there's going to be a low likelihood of both part one and part two of the opposition alliance. And that is what I argue we see in 1987 South Korean presidential elections between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Yong-sam, where they did not perceive that they were mutually dependent on each other and therefore did not form an alliance. But there will be certain cases where the party leaders perceive that they really need each other's help to win, and therefore there will be a high likelihood of part one and part two alliance occurring, and that is arguably what happened in 1986 in the Philippines between Corazon Aquino as well as Salvador Laurel when they competed against Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. And when will this perception of mutual dependency occur? In the book, I argue that when you have information about their relative strengths and weaknesses, then it's more likely that they will form an alliance, right? You can imagine that if there's very little information about who is stronger or weaker in what aspects, then people will believe drink the old Kool-Aid and believe that they can win on their own without needing to form an alliance with someone else. So in order to trace and demonstrate this kind of causal logic, I relied on a lot of qualitative materials from different sources. So there's the secondary literature, newspaper reports, autobiographies and diaries of opposition party leaders, as well as, most important for me, declassified American foreign policy documents. So these documents come from various sources. They come from the White House, they come from the United States State Department, they come from the CIA, and they can be found online as well as at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. So on the right-hand side, you can see the numerous boxes that I went through in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. And it shows just the top of one of these reports. It's a telegram sent to the White House Situation Room, which says Seoul, November 25th, 1981, right? It's just one of the reports that were sent through. And you can also see the screenshots of these two CIA secret reports about the elections that were happening at that time. So I use these American foreign policy documents as kind of a third-party verification of what was happening within the country at that time in trying to trace the perceptions of different actors within the opposition as well as in the government at that time. So triangulating all these different kinds of empirical evidence, I first did a comparison between Philippines and South Korea. So the questions again for us is the incumbent regime vulnerable? And I say yes for Philippines and yes for South Korea. But the mutual dependency question, I say yes for Philippines and no for South Korea. So why do I say that? And there are numerous empirical evidence. In this presentation, I'm just going to show a sliver of the empirical evidence. So I can elaborate much more on the other pieces of evidence. So on the first question, do the party leaders perceive that the regime was vulnerable? And I think most of the evidence says yes. Right? In both Philippines and South Korea, there were massive street protests. Obviously, in the Philippines, it was massive street protests that were galvanized by the people's reaction to the brutal assassination of Benigno Aquino as he stepped off the airplane at Manila airport when he came back to Manila from exile in the US. And in South Korea, there were massive street protests of the opposition against the military regime at that time. And these street protests were workers' protests. There were also protests by university students, and the state brutally repressed these protesters, both in the Philippines as well as in South Korea. And many protesters were injured and they lost their lives. So these public recurring mass protests is one indication to the opposition party leaders, right, that there was growing dissent amongst the public and growing against the government and growing support for the opposition. And this growing support for the opposition was very clearly manifested in the results of legislative elections a few years prior to the presidential elections. In these legislative elections, the opposition parties did not win outright to be able to form a majority in the legislature, but they were able to exceed their own expectations. Surprisingly, they won a lot of seats in the urban areas, especially in Seoul and Manila, which told the opposition party leaders, well, that they will increase their confidence, right? That they had a support amongst the urban public, the middle class, and therefore, if they compete in the future presidential elections, that they really have a chance to win. And then, of course, finally, the United States was a very strong key actor which party leaders perceive held the fate of the countries in their hands. And at that time, the United States very publicly withdrew their support for the two incumbent regimes. On the left-hand side, we can see a national security decision directive by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, which said that they were looking for orderly succession that leads to a stable transition away from the Marcos regime, and they are actively and discreetly supporting the efforts of diverse Filipino leaders. Right, and this included everyone from people within the Marcos party as well as responsible members of the Democratic opposition. For South Korea, it was also very clear when the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific Affairs, Gaston Seeger, said in a public speech at the US-Korea Society that the Korean government should democratize and hold free and fair elections as one of the conditions, right, to receiving continued support from the US administration. And it was very clear that the party leaders, both within the government as well as outside of the government, they knew this public withdrawal. So here you can see Robert C. McFarlane on the left writing a memo to the White House saying that they should the Vice President George Bush at that time should accommodate a visit by the Philippine opposition leader Salvador Laurel. And on the right, you can see Frank Carlucci, who's the resident Korean expert, saying that in the last paragraph, we have contact with every element of government and opposition in Korea, and the Koreans know what our policies are. Right. So based on this evidence, I think it is quite clear that the party leaders perceive that it was vulnerable. But then the question of, do they think they need each other to win? The evidence here is quite divergent. On the left, you can see a telegram from the Manila embassy back to Washington, D.C., saying that Salvador Laurel is the most conservative and organized of the opposition party leaders, whereas Corazon Aquino was the most popular. So they clearly knew, the United States knew what was their relative strengths and weaknesses, right? So it stands to reason that they should know their relative strengths and weaknesses. And there are plenty of other evidence that they know their strengths and weaknesses very well. But in South Korea, this telegram from Seoul back to Washington, D.C., says as 1985 drew to a close, the NKDP, which was the opposition party at the time, was in disarray and disrepute, torn by conflicting orders from the two Kims, reversing itself repeatedly over a number of issues. And they have been weakened by factional infighting. Right? So it clearly shows that the two party leaders were clearly at odds with each other and did not see themselves as mutually dependent on each other. Here again, we have a quote from Philip S. Kaplan, the Deputy Chief of Mission in Manila, saying that persuading Corazon Aquino to keep Salvador Laurel in the tent. And if you don't do it, you're not going to win. But if you do it to form this alliance, you're more likely going to win. And here is the top secret CIA report just on the eve of elections in South Korea, in the third paragraph, saying that both Kim Yong-sam and Kim Dae-jung remain convinced that they themselves can win the election, and neither is responding to pressure for a last-minute compromise on a single candidate. So I think the divergence in empirical evidence here is quite clear. So, all right, we have an idea about how the regime opposition will respond if they perceive that the regime is vulnerable. But oftentimes, party leaders perceive that the regime is not vulnerable, that the incumbent regime is very dominant, right? So the question then is, what can the opposition party leaders do? Well, the good news is that party leaders will still try to do something. And one of the things I suggest in my book is that there's still going to be a potential of engaging in the kind of part one legislative coordination, right? Where they split the seats among themselves, because you can think about splitting the seats among themselves as kind of sharing the different pieces of a pizza, right? So the only question is how many people, who gets the biggest slice of the pizza? And I argue that whether it's a high or low likelihood of this kind of part one coordination, we need to think about whether there is information that the parties have about their relative popularities across the electoral districts. So if party A knows that, oh, it is in the, say, southern provinces that they are very popular, then it is natural for them to lay claim to compete in the southern provinces, right? And therefore, it makes sense for party B not to compete in the southern provinces. So if you have very good information about the relative popularities across the electoral map, then there's going to be a high likelihood of coordination in part one, but lack of coordination, part one coordination, if you don't have that kind of information. So in order to, so this kind of completes the entire causal logic and tree in my book. And in order to show all these various potential outcomes, I use the cases of Malaysia and Singapore to illustrate all these potential outcomes. We can think of the comparison between Philippines and South Korea as just two cases only. But if we compare Malaysia and Singapore over a long period of time, over 5 decades, every single election is a case of potential alliance formation on its own, right? And in the book, I suggest that this is how I would map the empirical cases to the theoretical arguments, right? So we can see at the top, if there's a high perception of regime vulnerability, then there's then the question is there a high perception of mutual dependency? If that's yes, then we're going to observe national level candidate coordination and joint campaigns. And that is what happened in 1986 Philippines, as well as in 1990 Malaysia, 1999, 2013, 2018 Malaysia. But if there's low perception of mutual dependency, then that's going to be 1987 South Korea. But in the vast majority of cases, you're going to have perception of low regime vulnerability. And then the question is whether you have clear or unclear relative popularity. And the Singapore case and the Malaysian case shows that most of the cases fall within that lower branch. So to conclude, I think the perception of regime vulnerability and inter-party dependence strongly shape the incentives to build alliances on both part one and part two. And I think, therefore, it suggests that information environment with varying levels of uncertainty is a crucial factor in shaping these perceptions. And I think this argument goes a long way to help us understand why alliances is so rare and why defeating incumbent autocrats are so difficult. So if you're interested in the book, feel free to navigate yourself to the University of Michigan Press website. You can use, I still think it's valid, UMS 22 to get a 30% off the book. But if you know you are a poor graduate student or undergrad student, you can't afford the book, don't worry, it's also available for open access, free download on the website. So feel free to get a copy yourself. So thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to hear any thoughts from Jean as well as everyone else.
Thank you, Professor Ong. That was a really lucid and insightful and organized and succinct presentation of your main arguments. Before I turn the floor to the discussant, can I just encourage the audience, if you have any comments or questions for the author, please feel free to just add your comments or questions to the Q&A below. All right. On that note, could I pass the floor to Professor Hong when you're ready?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yeb, for giving me this opportunity to discuss this exciting book, exciting new book by a rising scholar in comparative politics, Elvin Ong. So I would just jump into the discussion of this book, and I think this book is an outcome of a very ambitious project to answer a, I would say, detrimentally crucial question for authoritarian election and democratic transition. That is, what explains an alliance or coalition formation among opposition parties in authoritarian election, where they fundamentally have a small chance of winning by structure. That's why we called it authoritarian election. Here today, I would like to briefly summarize. I mean, Dr. Ong summarized his own book better, but I would like to introduce my understanding of this book and to see if I understood anything wrong, and lay out the questions or suggestions I had along the line. So as Dr. Ong correctly points out in the introduction of this book, and repeat that argument, building a sustainable alliance that can go throughout the campaigning, which itself is hard, and an election could result in monumental consequences. It could lead to democratic transition for sure, but on the other side of the story, it can be not only continued, but even enhanced repression by the autocratic incumbent. But again, it can result in a crucial watershed point for political competition in authoritarian countries. That's why a lot of opposition leaders, although they know it would be difficult, and they might still have a small chance to win, and they know the incumbent wouldn't let them their coalition go through, but still there have been a lot of trials. So and also, as Elvin showed, once the alliance is formed, and then people know it will be sustainable, it will give them much higher chance to win in the upcoming election. So why, again, as well described in the book, why we don't see that much alliance in the history of authoritarian election that has been sufficiently accumulated so far. I think I summarized, basically I wrote some of the equation on my notes reading Elvin's book. So the simplest answer is the opposition leaders. They have the utility calculation in their mind. And that utility calculation, two perceptions, which was also introduced by Dr. Yeb, are very important in terms of the calculation of reward, in terms of calculation of cost, in terms of, most importantly, in terms of calculation of probability, which is a crucial part of that equation. So those two perceptions are how strong the big enemy and the big adversary in that election, which is the incumbent dictator. And the other is sort of the trust or the need amongst the opposition, which is more internal. Like, how do I trust? How do I trust the commitment from the other opposition party leader? How can we believe these alliance can be sustainable, not only before the election, but also after the actual arrangement of the perk and arrangement of the party leadership after party dynamics after the election. So and then of course, all of these calculations should be done on the pile of challenges that opposition parties have in terms of election rules, in terms of their weak ideological dominance, in terms of fewer resources, and long sort of history between the opposition parties or the party leaders. All right, so let me move on to, this is how in a few words how I understood and read the book. I hope I read it correctly, and as Dr. Ong intended. I think the merits of this book is just countless. I know author already summarized the contribution of this book to the field, but I think somehow there is underplay in his writing. Dr. Ong was so modest in sort of emphasizing the importance of this book. So here, let me also rephrase the contribution from my own perspective. I think first of all, it was a brilliant idea just to focus on the pre-election alliance formation. Because when we think about the opposition cooperation in authoritarian election, I think that there are two obstacles to achieve meaningful and robust analysis around it. One is it's really hard to define the cooperation. In spirit, in theory, or normatively, we believe opposition should cooperate. But in reality, it's very hard to observe as well. So I think that sort of difficulty in definition of opposition cooperation is one challenge. And the other challenge is that a lot of scholarly discussion, and also including former model style argument, has sort of assumed the opposition as a one unity for simplicity of analysis. So a lot of previous studies sort of assume the oppositions or even the supporters for the opposition would be one group ultimately in the end, especially in the case where the democratization is very near, and then sort of assume those cases of opposition split in front of the democratization is very rare case. So in many studies I have read so far, the 1987 split between two Kims, two main opposition leaders for decades up to democratization in South Korea, have been considered as a sort of exceptional case where both of the leaders were very, very greedy about them having the power to himself, but not a rational choice kind of approach. So I was really glad reading this chapter about South Korea in Dr. Ong's book, which described both of the party leaders as a rational actor in terms of calculating their parties and their themselves own utility in this game. So that's I think that's one of the beauty in this book. So by focusing on the pre-election alliance only, I think Dr. Ong sort of shed lights on so many complicated or unclear, ambiguous concepts that has been around in the field. A second contribution and second sort of big impression, big thumbs up I had reading this book is the importance of perception. So I think we're discussing about intra-opposition dynamics, where there are actually a lot of players in it. And then how each players perceive the situation, perceive their own popularity is detrimentally important, especially under authoritarian election, because in democratic election, we do have polls every day, right? And, there are maybe too many polls that confuses us. But in authoritarian election, these kind of information flow is intentionally blocked, and then each of including the incumbent, each of the players cannot know the true popularity or true stance of their own party or themselves as candidates. So I think this perception part is very well elaborated in the book, and it's the core difference it could be core difference between the opposition coalition in democratic system versus in authoritarian election. And finally, although Dr. Ong did not use mathematical equation, but I think the whole idea of approaching this question is very game theoretical. And then I noticed one of the one of the work that was most frequently cited especially in the theory part, is James Fearon's article, which is not actually about election, but about war and signaling game during the war. So my former advisor, one of my favorite quotes from my former advisor, Adam Shporsky, is that election is a method of processing conflict, and it can be a peaceful method to process a conflict as long as certain conditions are met. So it's very hard to process a conflict peacefully, but with election, and if we can meet certain conditions, it can be done peacefully. So I think it's not surprising to use a game theoretic explanation for strategies in war to explain election and coalition formation before the election. And I think the application is very meaningful. So far was my sort of big acclamation for the achievement of this book. From here, I would like to mention a few sort of thoughts I had while reading this book. So one question that kept occurring in my mind while reading this masterpiece book about opposition coalition building is how we can define a successful opposition alliance. So I fully understand the focus of Dr. Ong in this book is the existence of the opposition alliance. So, I mean, this could be a typical ontology versus epistemology question, but how can we understand the opposition alliance being successful? So, it itself, the existence of which is difficult. So, you know, in this book, Dr. Ong talked about the emergence and sustainment of such alliance, how challenging it will be. It is to just merely exist. But like when we think about the actual meaning in history of democracy or political history of a country, I think it's meaningful to think about what can be a success, what can be at least a opposition alliance formation as a meaningful event for the shift in political landscape of a country. I mean, we can think of a few easy answers. So if the alliance achieved democratization, in other words, winning the authoritarian incumbent as an alliance can be easily defined as a success. But there might be other alliances, successful, formed or not formed, but that has shifted the authoritarian election, the landscape of authoritarian election in a country. So I'm gonna talk about 1971 South Korean authoritarian alliance in a moment. That alliance, I would say, by the definition of Dr. Ong, was successful because there was a primary election among the opposition leaders at the time. Among them, Tu Kim was the primary candidates as well. But in the end, eventually the 1971 primary election among the opposition leaders were evaluated as a sort of watershed case that Tu Kims lost trust about each other, because Kim Yong-sam believed that 1971 opposition primary election was rigged by Kim Dae-jung. And then eventually that affected 1987 negatively. And that also forced Kim Yong-sam made the three-party merger with the former authoritarian party, and then become a democratic president eventually. So, you know, I think it's a complicated question to define how to define a success as an opposition alliance. And then obviously it's an open-end question, but I think it's some difficult question that we can think of, in longer spectrum of democratization and sustainable democracy after the democratization. All right, so I'll skip the other part, and then I'll just mention one promising field of future research that I thought for myself and also for other comparative politics students is how the voters perceive. We're talking about the perception of incumbent, perception of opposition leaders, but how voters perceive these dynamics in opposition party and making alliance. Dr. Ong mentioned this briefly in the presentation and also in the book, but he also has an excellent publication in American Journal of Political Science where he conducted a field experiment, conducted an experiment in Malaysia to see how, what are the conditions that voters actually support the opposition alliance or not. I thought I'm a big fan of that article. And then I think there are much more things to elaborate starting from your book and your AJPS article about how the authoritarian voters evaluate their own election, evaluate their own opposition parties along with the incumbent government. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hong, for your insightful analysis and especially the insider view of South Korea dynamics. Professor Hong, would you like to address Professor Hong's arguments first? Or would you want to take that all together with the questions from the audience that I will summarize for you?
Maybe I'll just have a very quick response to the two things that she mentioned. So number one, I think she talked about the question of how do you define a successful opposition alliance, right? And I think that is a really interesting question because we often think, well, a successful opposition alliance is one that wins, right? If it doesn't win, is it still successful? And to some extent, you can say in Malaysia, because there were recurring elections. So the question might be a little bit more relevant to the Malaysia case. And in the Malaysia case, the first instance of a very cohesive opposition alliance was in 1999, and that alliance lost, but one could say that it shifted the opposition landscape, right? Because it opened up people to imagine the possibility that, oh, that these ideologically disparate opposition parties could actually come together and they could actually kind of make an impact, although there were various problems that kind of hampered them. So this shifting of perceptions of the opposition of the landscape is a little bit difficult to define, but I guess we can spend some time writing it down. So I think ultimately even opposition party alliances that don't win might have some like kind of effects over the longer term. Second, in terms of the perceptions of how voters perceive the dynamics of opposition parties and alliances, I think again that is a very interesting question, which I'm starting to think about potentially exploring in maybe one or two works, I think. The crucial issue is, you have to think of every kind of electoral autocracy is kind of unique in its own way. Some are more competitive, some are less competitive. So in Malaysia, it's probably no longer useful to ask that question because there's already some kind of regime turnover. Things are very messy right now. But in Singapore, that could be a potential question, right? Because Singapore, the dominant party is still very dominant. The opposition parties are still very weak. There's constant talk about voters supporting an alliance, but we don't really know whether it kind of makes a difference or not. So maybe that question is potentially more interesting in Singapore. And I have to think hard about developing a research design for that. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you very much. So let's go to the Q&A.